The wind whipped cold across the tarmac of RAF Tangmere, February 1944. Not the roar of Merlin engines yet, just the biting, indifferent silence of a Sussex winter morning. Ground crew shuffled, breath clouding in the pale, weak light. Flight Lieutenant Ian Dusty Miller, the silence was the heaviest sound of all. He stood by his Spitfire Mk.9, K9B, running a gloved hand over the camouflage paint, the familiar geometry of the fighter a strange comfort. Dusty was a pilot of quiet reputation, steady, methodical, a man who treated flying less like an adventure and more like a deeply complex, solitary craft. He was part of 401 Squadron, a Canadian unit, but that morning the sky held no nationality, only promise of battle. Their target, a crucial railway hub deep in occupied France, a linchpin in Hitler's Atlantic Wall defenses. This wasn't just another escort mission, it was deep penetration, a high-risk gamble. But what Dusty was about to discover, what would etch this day into his memory not as a clash of nations but as a desperate duel with metal and physics, was not the enemy's flak, but the fragile, brilliant heart of his own machine. The briefing had been brief, the faces of his squadron mates grim. Maintain altitude, hit the target, get home. Simple words for an impossible task. Strapped into the cockpit, the familiar smells, oil, burnt cordite, leather, were a constant, low-frequency hum of impending danger. At 20,000 feet, the world was a canvas of deep blue above, and a mottled, snowy white below. The Spitfire, that magnificent piece of aerodynamic poetry, felt alive in his hands. He thought, as he often did, of the engineers, the forgotten masters who had made this possible. Specifically, of the genius who had conceived the very heart of its power, the gearbox. Now, most people think of an engine as a simple affair, a piston pumping. But the Spitfire's great leap, its roar, came from the reduction gearbox nestled between the mighty Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and the propeller blades. It was a mechanical ballet, a piece of industrial art. The engine, running at a furious, efficient 3,000 revolutions per minute, needed to spin the massive three-bladed propeller at a slower, more effective speed, perhaps 1,000 revolutions per minute, to grip the air and prevent the blade tips from breaking the sound barrier. The gearbox, often a planetary gear system, was the silent translator, the mechanical link that turned explosive power into thrust. It was a watchmaker's precision inside a war machine's fury. And today Dusty would learn the true meaning of that delicate balance. The first puffs of flak, black orchids blooming against the blue, were the sign. They were over the target. Tracer fire streaked past, angry red lines crossing the sky. Dusty banked hard, checking his wingman, Flying Officer Pete "Red" McKay, who was already engaging a pair of lurking Focke-Wulfs. The air was suddenly thick with violence. Dusty's 6.303 Browning machine guns and the 220mm Hispano cannons hammered out their reply. He felt the jarring recoil, the smell of cordite sharp and metallic in his oxygen mask. He lined up on a lone FW-190, a brutal, square-shouldered brute of an airplane. A sharp burst, and the German fighter exploded in a blossoming cloud of flame and smoke. But in the maelstrom, the flak found them. Not a direct hit, but a terrible, jarring impact that slammed into the Spitfire's belly. The controls went momentarily loose and Dusty cursed, pulling hard on the stick. He was still flying, but a new, more sinister sound began to cut through the familiar roar. A rhythmic, grating clank clank clank. 7:30 to 11 o'clock, the wound, a mechanical heartbreak. Dusty glanced at his gauges. Oil pressure was dropping, but the engine was still turning. The vibration, however, was terrifying. It wasn't the shaking of heavy firing. It was a deeper, more profound shudder, emanating from the nose, from the propeller hub itself. The reduction gearbox. The thought hit him with the chilling clarity of high-altitude air. Something had shattered, a tooth ripped from a gear wheel, a bearing pulverized by shrapnel. The Merlin engine, that powerhouse of British engineering, was fighting to maintain 3,000 revolutions per minute, but the gear system, the delicate mechanism that managed that phenomenal power transfer to the prop, was wounded. The clanking became a screeching, tearing sound. The propeller, once a blur of efficient force, was now shaking violently. If the gears completely seized, the torque would rip the engine from its mountings, or worse, the engine would overspeed and tear itself apart, throwing propeller blades through the wings, through the cockpit. "Red, I'm taking a hit. Gearbox trouble, I'm losing power and vibrating violently," Dusty radioed, his voice tight, suppressing the instinctive fear. "Roger, Dusty. I see oil, you're trailing smoke. Get out, man. Bail out." Red's voice crackled with urgency. "Negative. Too deep. I'll try to nurse it." To bail out here meant certain capture. He had a duty, a stubborn, unyielding need to get the Spitfire, this extension of his will, home. 11 to 15:30, the duel, pilot versus machine. This was no longer a dogfight against the Luftwaffe, it was a duel against the forces of mechanical failure. Dusty pushed the stick forward, seeking the clean, thin air of a dive to gain speed. But diving put greater stress on the engine, on the wounded gear. He had to find the sweet spot, the exact RPM where the engine still provided enough thrust for flight, but where the shattered gears didn't tear themselves apart. He throttled back, experimenting with minute adjustments. The engine RPM fell to 2,500. The clanking lessened to a heavy, sickening grinding. But his airspeed plummeted. Stall speed. He had to keep the nose up. He nursed the throttle up slightly. 2,600 revolutions per minute. The grinding intensified, a metallic scream of protest. He could feel the heat radiating through the firewall. The cockpit filled with the sharp, acidic smell of burning oil and hot metal. He was flying on a knife edge. Too little power, he crashed. Too much power, the engine disintegrated. He remembered a lecture from an engineer back in training. The reduction gear is the unsung hero. If it goes, you are effectively flying a brick with a firework strapped to the front. The irony was bitter. The same brilliant piece of engineering that gave the Spitfire its climb rate was now its executioner. He glanced at his reflection in the Perspex canopy. Pale eyes wide. He was calculating trajectories, damage reports, and engine tolerance limits, all simultaneously, instinctively. He flew by the sound and the feel of the vibration, seeking that fragile zone of flight. 15:30 to 18:30, the retreat, the longest journey. He was alone now. Red had stayed until the French coast, fending off a late attacker before being forced to return for fuel. Dusty was now skimming the waves of the channel, his crippled aircraft sputtering and shaking, a wounded bird trying to make the shore. Every minute was an eternity. The grinding was constant now, a horrible rhythmic death rattle. He imagined the broken gear teeth chewing themselves to pieces inside the housing, spraying metal filings and heat. He had throttled down to the minimum necessary for lift, barely 160 knots, and he knew he was losing altitude. The coast. The white cliffs of Dover. A pale, welcome sight through the gloom. He radioed Tangmere Tower. This is K9B, crippled engine, severe reduction gear failure. Request immediate straight-in landing. The controller's voice, calm and steady, was a lifeline. Roger, K9B, straight in. Field clear. Good luck, Dusty. He crossed the threshold low. The moment he cut the throttle for the landing, the grinding stopped. The silence was deafening, terrifying. He put the Spitfire down hard, a perfect three-point landing born of years of practice, skidding slightly on the wet grass. The engine was dead. He sat there, heart pounding, the stench of overheated oil choking him. He had done it. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft. They didn't need to be told. The front of the Spitfire, where the propeller hub met the engine, was black with oil and heat-crazed metal. Later, the mechanics would examine the engine. The reduction gearbox was catastrophically damaged. Several teeth were missing, the housing cracked. They told him it was a miracle, sheer luck that the engine hadn't seized solid or thrown a blade. But Dusty knew it wasn't luck. It was the human equation, the ingenuity of the engineer who built the gearbox, and the tenacity of the pilot who had flown it, not by the book, but by his own sheer will, finding the delicate, desperate balance between power and destruction. The pilot's triumph was not in the dogfight. It was in the gentle, relentless struggle against his own machine, the resilience of the pilot matching the brilliance of the forgotten genius. Dusty climbed out of the cockpit, stretched his cramped limbs, and simply walked away. The engine had given its all. And so had he. The war went on, but the story of the genius in the propeller hub, and the pilot who saved it, was etched forever into the history of the skies.